Welcome to Legacy Virtual Users Group November Hangout. We're going to get started in a few minutes, but the first thing I wanted to do was remind you of two important points. The first is to check your audio settings when you first come into a Hangout, and that's the gear in the upper right-hand corner. And the second is to open your chat window, and you'll find your chat section over on the left-hand side. And if you do these two things, you'll be ready to go when we start the Hangout. Now, the first thing I'd like to do is welcome you all to the Hangout and let you know that Google made some changes in the past couple of weeks to Hangouts, so I thought we'd take a quick tour and see what's different. This is the new Hangout screen, and you probably notice if you've been at a previous Hangout that the screen is just a little bit different. Rather than have your tools run across the top of the screen, Google's making use of the left-hand side of the screen, and the tools have icons which go color or light up when they're clicked and in use, and are grayed out when they're not in use. You can close the tools by clicking on this top bar here, so that you have a full large screen. Your chat column is now at the top right hand side, and you'll note then when you type in your chat, when you type the chat in the box at the bottom right hand corner and press enter, then your chat information is going to show up as a running chat in this column. This is a good place for links, notes, and questions that you want to ask, but you don't want to interrupt the presenter. Now, at the top right hand corner is where you can engage in your sound check, to check your mic, to see whether your webcam is working, and also to check your settings. And this icon right over here is a telephone handset, which I find kind of interesting because I believe it's Google's throwback to an earlier time. It's a telephone in a cradle, and this is the icon you're going to want to click when you are ready to exit out of the Hangout. So hopefully this gives you a sense of the new screen. I want to point out a couple of the icons. This, as I mentioned before, is the section that you can click on in order to make your screen larger and to close out the applications. Now, in the future, the Hangouts, if they're named, that's going to appear right here. So you'll usually see LVUG and then whatever the month of the Hangout is up here. People can be invited to the Hangout. This is where you'd click on the chat button. If you want to share your screen, for instance, the presenter will be doing this. There's also something called a Hangout Toolbox, and you'll want to add that from the Add Apps section because that gives you a variety of additional apps to use. We could also click on the YouTube button and be able to watch a YouTube video together. So when you go to your Hangout Toolbox and open it, it will open up in the far right-hand corner, and there's a number of extensions. The one I'm going to point out is the lower third extension, and it's also listed here. There's volume control and also a comment tracker. So there's a number of items in there that are just helpful if you want to work with the Hangout as a moderator. Now, what happens when you open the lower third, as you can see, I've clicked on it and then it opens over in this chat section, but you can add your name, you can choose a color that you want the ribbon to be, and you can choose a file. What I did here was I just made up with a scrapbook paper, but you could use anything else. I put my name in, and then in this instance it's that I'm in the Guild of One Name Studies for the USA West region. I could also put in here that I was a member of the Legacy Virtual Users Group. But what ends up happening is once you click on the On button and you've included this information and then anything else you want to, your name will always show up in this lower third section with whatever avatar that you decide to use, and that way we're not always looking for people's names. So it might be something you want to play with, have a little fun, and come up with some, and what you can do is come up with a few presets depending on if you want to put your company name in here, the genealogy area you cover, what have you. So now let's get started with Timelines and Legacy, which is this month's presentation. And what we're going to be discussing is timelines, and that is any kind of timeline, whether you find it online, in various programs, or in the Legacy program. I'm your presenter today, Tessa Keogh. Now, a genealogy database program helps us to see our family. However, our view is always dependent upon the type and quality of the data that we put into our program. How Legacy helps us provide that view is based on how we enter data, sources, locations, media and documents, and how we add all of that to our work product. It's also determined by how we sort our data, what reports we decide to use, and what options we select for those reports, whether we take our Legacy data and put it into another program or publish it within Legacy. Our genealogy research cycle is a constant back and forth between, or probably a circle constantly going round and round. We find an individual and look for ancestors and descendants. We find vital statistics, or the facts, on our people, and we search both offline and more often online for additional records. We also ask for stories, photos, and histories, both from family members and published sources, whether that's newspapers, journals, books, and GEDCOMs. There is so much information. The question is, how do we gather it, analyze it, publish it, and most importantly, how do we put it in context? I'd like to introduce you to the family in the center. This is my great-grandparents, Lawrence Edward and Catherine Matilda Murphy, and 8 of their 12 children. My grandmother Dora is the blonde toddler in her mother's arms. Now, Legacy's pedigree view shows the information that is in a family view, as well as additional generations that go backward and forward for that individual person. In this instance, Lawrence Edward Murphy is our primary person, and we're able to see his parents, James Joseph and Ellen Kiley, as well as their parents. We can also see Lawrence's wife, Catherine Matilda Murphy, all 12 of their children, as well as Lawrence's siblings. Now, in Legacy's family view, it shows us our family members, a couple, their parents, and their children, together with some general information. And that type of information, those 5 choices, are choices you make and you can add to your Legacy program. It also shows marriage information, as well as birth and death years. And this is all for Lawrence Edward and Catherine Matilda Murphy. And no, that's not a mistake. In my family, we have Murphys marrying Murphys here, and they're not related. Now, Legacy's individual view shows the central person in more detail. We're able to drill down and add more detail to basically flesh out the individual, or to put some meat on the bones. Here's where you add facts and events, and as we learned last month during Linda's excellent presentation on adding events, you can add your research, photograph, and additional facts, and any other information you want to include. You can use alternative vital statistics. You can enter census, immigration, occupation, property information, as well as tax information. Really, it's up to you, whatever you choose. Now, that's all well and good to have all this information, but how do we place all this information in context? Well, that's the point of timelines. A timeline is a way of displaying a list of events in chronological order. And timelines are used to help understand events and trends, and are especially useful in studying history, as they convey a sense of change over time. So if we were to look at Lawrence Murphy's chronology view in Legacy, we see that Legacy takes all that information that we input, the birth, the marriage, the census, the children's information, and it sets out a chronology or a timeline for our individual based upon everything we added to the individual view. By using the options in Legacy, you can show the age in the left-hand side, you can color code pertinent data for the spouse and the children, and you can lay out your individual's story so far. So why use timelines? Well, because our ancestors did not live in a vacuum, and events constantly happened around them and to them. In order to piece together the puzzle that is their lives, we need to add local, national, and world events and facts to their personal chronologies. We need to answer the question, what types of events shaped their local communities, their state, their country, and their world? Now, this is a quick list that I made of the types of events that might shape my ancestors' lives. Certainly, immigration, migration, religion, and wars enter in. What events would you add to this list? Because if we keep track of these types of events, we're able to put our ancestors' lives in context. So where do we find timelines? Well, there are several ways to find this type of information. It used to be that books and encyclopedias were used often to come up with timelines for history. But today, with computers and the internet, you can easily start by using your browser and searching for the time frame, geographic area, or types of events and facts that you're interested in learning more about. Here we're going to search on Google for Washington State, history, and timelines. A quick search with those three terms brought back over 6 million results in a matter of moments. How do we sort through all those results? Well, Google prioritizes results, and once you find a result that basically fits the bill for you, use the Google search function for similar results to narrow your focus. Probably one of the best websites you can go to for links for all things genealogy is Cindy's List. This is a labor of love and dedication by Cindy Howell, and it provides us with some amazing links and a search as simple as timelines brought back both a category index and related categories. Now, I'd like to give a special shout out to Cindy's List over the holiday season. She does great work on a daily basis to keep this website up, and it's provided free for everyone's use. So you might want to consider a donation to Cindy's List through PayPal this holiday season. Another great website is about.com genealogy. I just typed in timelines and genealogy and got these results. As you can see, there's a wide variety of general and specialized timelines, everything from ancient history to the chronology of Sweden and everything in between. And finally, this is a great website specifically set up for timelines called ourtimelines.com. When you arrive at the home page, just click over here on Timeline in the left-hand corner, and then you can insert the name and the birth and death year of a person. You can also not include a name and just have a time frame. You can select historical events, technology events, personal history, and then when you click on that Generate Timeline bar, this is what happens. You get a custom timeline for Lawrence Murphy in this case, from his birth in 1862 to his death in 1918. Now, personally, I could do without the black background, but I'm not going to complain because it comes up for free and it's very clear. When you take a look at the custom timeline, you see various types of events: political, cultural, educational, technological, and international events, with the individual's age at the time of each event. As you can see, World War I started when Lawrence Murphy was 52 years old. Now, this timeline is excellent, but the one downside is that your individual's timeline in Legacy is separate from the timeline in another program. So where are the timelines in Legacy? Well, they're there. The question is, how do you find them? If you click on View in the top menu and then Timelines in that drop-down box, you've found them. Now, I want to take a step back here before we look at the actual timelines in Legacy. Some of you may be familiar with Progeny Genealogy Inc. It's a company out of Nova Scotia, Canada, and they make a variety of add-on programs for Legacy as well as other genealogy database programs. Some of you may be familiar with Map My Family Tree, Charting Companion, Gene Lines, and Trellis Chart. Gene Lines is a $19.95 download. It's a timeline charting companion for Legacy, and it can be found on the add-ons page at Legacy. It reads your legacy data files and provides some information. However, I don't think this program has been upgraded or added to since it was originally published, and I think that Legacy incorporated certain of the timelines as a start for use with their program. So let's take a look. In this timelines program, one of the data sets is timelines for each state as well as the United States. I took a small family and loaded Minnesota state timeline. As you can see, it is not the most recent layout. It looks like a mid-version of DOS or an earlier Windows program, and I've not seen that it's been updated. But when you select the timeline and the person and family, and there are several variations on that theme, this is the result you get. Again, this is a good start and it puts the entire family in, and you can edit the history files and see many different views, but it basically gives you some very general, cursory pieces of information about Minnesota's history. Now in Legacy, there are 52 timelines in the deluxe version. I took a look at the timelines that come with Legacy, and about 75% of the timelines are from GeneLines. I've also noticed that Legacy also hasn't done anything to update this feature since it originally came out, and I believe that that was in about 2005. I think Legacy added these timelines in hopes that you might purchase GeneLines. I'm hoping, but I have nothing to base this on, that timelines are one of the areas that Legacy is updating currently, as that's an area that's received significant attention from other genealogy database programs in their recent updates and revamps, both RootsMagic and Family Tree Maker. Now timelines in Legacy, as I mentioned, are a good start, but at this point I would give them a B for the concept and the actual practice. I'd give them a C for the depth of information included, and a D for encouraging and educating Legacy users to add to the knowledge base. Now let's take a look at how the timelines look straight out of the box for 3 items: U.S. presidents, U.S. wars, and U.S. states and territories dates of organization and admission. Now, the information is cursory and none of it is sourced, and we're going to look at the first 2 examples, and I think we can all agree that there's a lot more to both of these stories. We all know that Thomas Jefferson was the 3rd president, and the date range for his presidency is 1801 through 1809. But there's no longer description of his presidency and no source of information. And I'm sure we can all agree that there were a number of things that occurred during his presidency which might be of interest in our timeline. Also in U.S. wars, what's highlighted here is the American Revolution, which took place from 1775 to 1783, and the longer description simply states that it was between English colonists and Great Britain. Again, it's not sourced. As I'm sure we can all agree again, there's a lot more to that story than that short description. Now, the bad news is that this hasn't been updated or added to. The good news is that it's quite easy to edit the timelines in Legacy, and it's quite easy to add your own timelines to Legacy. So let's take a look at the parts of a Legacy timeline. The first item is the timeline identification, and this is where you identify the preparer and the date. The next is the title or the name of the timeline, and you can group similar timelines together. The third item is the date range, and this can be the starting and ending date. It can be a year or it can be a complete date. The next item is the short description. This is limited to 80 characters, so you might want to give it a bit of thought. The next item is the long description. Here's where you can provide the full story, and always remember that you can use double brackets for information that you don't want to be printed. And finally, the source of your information. Always be sure to cite your sources and provide the date accessed. As you can see, you can make changes to an existing timeline by clicking on Edit, or you can add a new timeline by clicking on New, which brings up this box, Create New Timeline, and it opens up in the timeline description and requires you to add that description. Once you've done that, you can always later change the timeline description, and keep in mind that's not the name or the title of the timeline. A bit odd in my opinion, but that's the way Legacy set it up. And you can always rename the timeline. Both of these items show up in the Options button. And here's where you could put your source and the date you access the information. Now let's look at a timeline in more detail. When we click on Canada, Census, and the Edit button, we bring up the timeline editor for Canada Census. And as you can see, there are 6 events in the timeline, and they show up here in date order. And the one we're looking at here is the first one with a date range of 1871, and it's when the 1871 census began. So once you've opened up the timeline editor box and it's opened up to Canada Census, you're ready to play with that timeline. Now, as you can see, the 6 entries in this timeline include the date range, the short description, but there's no long description and no source of information. So I find this timeline rather cursory. Well, if you were interested in Canada's censuses because maybe your family is from there, you might be wondering to yourself, how can you improve it? And I would use that question with every timeline that's in Legacy. Well, the way I'd go about improving it would be to find the size of the population for the entire country and for the various provinces that I'm interested in. I'd want to add the questions that were asked on the census as well as the source of that data and information. And then I'd be sure to include the date I added any additional information so I'd know how to update as necessary. Now, do you have any other ideas on what you'd add to the timeline? Now, with the 6 entries for Canada Census, it's not a problem to take a look at all 6 entries or to add all of those to a timeline. However, if you're looking at Inventions timeline, what would you do with a timeline that had 484 entries? As you can see with this number of inventions, there are far too many listed to make use of in a chronology. It would literally take over the individual's chronology, as Randy Seaver found out when he was playing around with timelines in Legacy a few weeks ago. So what do? Well, you take a look at the ones that are of interest to you, and you simply tag them. You're able to tag selected events for inclusion in a timeline. Perhaps only inventions that you or your ancestors would consider important during their lifetimes are the ones you're interested in. And all you have to do is check the boxes or tag them, and those can be included in your inventions timeline. It's not like you're losing the other 480 entries. It's just that they won't be printed in your chronology. This is a way of filtering or limiting the number of events in a timeline. You might also want to tag selected timelines for inclusion as a group in a chronology report. Here, in this instance, I'm interested in the U.S. federal census, the history of Nebraska and Washington, and the censuses of Nebraska and Washington, because Lawrence Murphy lived in both of those places during his life. I'm not interested in South Africa or Welsh history, nor am I interested in any of the other states. So I've simply tagged those 5 timelines, and those will be included in my chronology report. So keep in mind that you can, rather than filter, you can layer by including several timelines for your reports. Now, before we go any further, let's go back just one step to find out where the timelines can be found in your file system. They're in Legacy, and for me that's on my hard drive, but for others it might be on an external drive or in the cloud. And then once you've looked at the Legacy program, it's in Timelines, and depending on the language you use, for me that's English, all the timelines are filed here, so the original ones and any that you might add are all in alphabetical order. You can also see the date that a timeline was modified, as well as the size of the timeline. So if you have timelines to share, you can publish them to others and file them here. As you can see, the last timeline, Pennsylvania, was one of the original timelines, and it's dated 2005. You can also get a sense of the file size. Now, we've discussed timelines in general, timelines you find online, and timelines that are in Legacy. But if you're not satisfied with any of those, how do you make your own timeline? I think the process of making a timeline is basically a three-step process. First, you need to decide on a topic and the list of events or facts. Second, you need to research the dates and events, and you need to include your sources. And third, you need to draft the chronology and then input it and save it into Legacy. So what types of timelines would be important to your ancestors' stories? Perhaps if your family was here during the Revolutionary or the Civil War, that would be of great importance to your ancestors' life and times. Or perhaps your family was in another country, and that history at that point would be of interest to you. Perhaps they were active in a company or a business. Perhaps they were active in a faith group. Perhaps they were active in the labor movement in this country, and you'd want to include the labor history. Perhaps they were active in a school or a university or served in the military. Any of those types of activities would be something that you might want to make a timeline for. I'm sure there's many other examples of timelines, so why don't you give it some thought? Now this Wordle is a simple reminder that I make, and I just make up the Wordles and then stick them on my desktop to remind myself that I plan to add certain things to my Legacy program. And in this case, I have listed the countries because they're all places where my ancestors originated, and then the states are all places where they either arrived, moved to, or ended up. I plan simply to work my way through the group and check them off as I complete them. Now here are some tips for timelines. First off, you can't include everything. Decide on what is the most important to get your point across, but keep in mind that you can always use the tagging system. Second, use short sentences and an active voice in your writing. Remember, non-genealogists might want to be entertained and informed, but they certainly don't want to be bored to death. Third, provide the full story in the long description, and remember that you can use the double bracket system to keep that information out of print. Fourth, review and revise your draft. Ask yourself, does the sequence flow? Are you able to explain occurrences, or do any of those occurrences in the chronology suggest new areas to add? And finally, cite your sources. It's always important to give your readers and yourself the sources so that you can refer back to them to learn more about it, but also so that you give credit where credit's due. So let's take a look at this in practice. This is an example of Newfoundland history, and this is a timeline that I put together. The timeline title is Newfoundland General History. The timeline description is Newfoundland's history and important dates put together using Wikipedia, Canada Archives, and Chibatco, which is a volunteer Newfoundland history and records group. Now when we open the timeline editor, we get the date range, and here the one that's highlighted is 1949. The short description is that the province of Newfoundland was formed on March 31st, 1949. Now the long description goes into great detail about the choices, the vote, and the result of the decision by the voters and the British government on whether Newfoundland would remain an independent colony or join a union with Canada or the United States. Now, as you can imagine, the British government quashed the idea of joining the United States, although some Newfoundlanders continue to believe that that was done by voter fraud, and Newfoundland ended up voting to join Canada. I've included the entire story, but I realized that if I were to share this chronology with my family members, well, in the first place, they're not that familiar with Newfoundland's history, and in the second place, I don't think most of them want to learn more about it. So keep in mind that the use of double brackets will help you edit the story, and know that you can always edit it. Finally, the source of the information always provides where you got the information from so that you can update it or go back to the source. As you can see here, I took some of this information from FamilySearch.org's history. Now, as you can see from this general history, some of these events will show me new areas to be aware of. In the first instance, in 1923, women in Newfoundland were eligible to vote for the first time. So I'd want to start looking at voting registers for my female ancestors. In 1939 to 1945, Newfoundland was heavily involved in the war effort, and many people from Newfoundland assisted both overseas as well as at home at an Air Force base that the American and British governments placed at Gander. Keep in mind that after 1949, I should be looking to Canada for records, but before that date, Newfoundland's records were maintained locally, and some of the records are available in Great Britain. These types of events or facts added to your timelines help you tell your ancestors' stories and give you additional places and record sets to check out. So how do we actually put together a timeline? I'm going to walk you through what I did to come up with a timeline for the state of Washington. I did that basically for purposes of this Hangout today. Now, I originally mentioned Cindy's list as a great starting point to, quote, learn more about it. Here we searched United States, Washington, history and culture, and our results include links to the Washington History Timeline, which is a good start that you can follow up with other websites, particular articles, and other summaries, depending on your particular interest for what you want to know about Washington history. Another good site is SHG Resources. They have unsourced timelines of state histories, and this is another good place to start, and then you'll want to follow that up with additional research. But they have great timelines with just the dates. Of course, FamilySearch.org has always been an early stop for any of my research, as they provide excellent state and county research as well as country research articles at their wiki. Many of these wiki articles were originally part of the written summaries that you found at the Family History Library. Keep in mind that not only are there several topics for each state, perhaps you're interested in ethnic groups or immigration, but right here you can get history information. But they also list out all of the counties in a particular state. Now maybe your ancestors only lived in 2 or 3 counties in a particular state, and you might want to click on those counties and focus a little bit more on local history. This really provides some more meat to the bones of your timeline. Now you can also go to the state resources to find out information, whether that's the Genealogical Society or the Historical Society or even the state's tourist board. You're going to want to take a look at several different topics, perhaps companies, local areas, culture, sports, or politics for the areas your ancestors lived in, and then you'll get a more local history. Now, one of my favorite sites is Wikipedia. I think they have tremendous research articles, many of them with sources, so you can take your research back to the primary resource. The articles are well written, sourced, and give a nice overview with links to several areas: geography, history, demographics, politics, and culture, just to name a few. In this instance, I use the population statistics for my timeline, which are all sourced and come from the U.S. Census Bureau. So, what I did was after I went to each of those sites, I came up with a Word document that I made by gathering the timeline information from those various sites just referenced. I added the information in different font color so that I'll always have a record of where I got the information. And you can see that down here, data sources for use for citations. The black color was SHG Resources. The wine color was Things to Do from the state of Washington. My historical population information came from Wikipedia. And finally, the blue font was FamilySearch.org. Now, all that information is related to Washington state history. And once you have that draft, you can focus on whatever information you think is important to your ancestor's story. Now, my ancestors arrived in Washington state at various times. Some were in Washington while it was a territory. Others came to Washington after it became a state. Several worked in the mines, others farmed, and during World War II, many of my ancestors worked in the defense industry. Now, all families were affected by the wars our country is engaged in. And in a couple instances, like right here, someone else might not be interested in this, but my grandfather actually worked on the Grand Coulee Dam, and our family grew up on Queen Anne Hill, which is the backyard for the Seattle Center, which was where the Seattle World's Fair was held. So there's a number of things that I might add to a history of Washington that someone else would not include. But that's why it's nice to have that complete Word document that then you can cut and paste and add to Legacy. By making sure that the history of Washington State is included in my timeline, I can weave my ancestors' story with the story of the state of Washington. Now this is my timeline, and it's listed as U.S., History, States, and then Washington. And you can see that by doing it this way, all of the states are listed in alphabetical order. My timeline description includes my sources and the date the timeline was entered or added. Now from the earliest information, that's when the land was claimed by Spain, to the census information, which provides the size of population, I have added a number of the items from my Word document. But I haven't finished doing that, and I just wanted to show you that you could add a number of items, switch out, and just go to something like the population. And I did this so I could get all the population information together with the source in an easy cut and paste format. But at whatever point, I can go back and add additional information from that timeline, and then later I can sort that information. All of those particular entries can be sorted in date order, so I don't have to worry about adding the information in correct date order. All I have to do is sort it. So this is really something that you can play around with in the timeline editor, and I'd suggest you do it just to get the hang of it. Now once your timelines are in Legacy, you might want to play around with using the timelines in your chronology reports. Well, how do we do that, or how do we find them? Well, you go to Chronology and you open the Chronology options. And once you've done that, you'll come to the Include tab, and then you just click on Select Background Timelines. And once you do that, it brings up the Select Timelines box, and then you can add any timelines that you want individually, or if you had a group already here, you could remove the timelines you didn't want to use. Now take a look at the fact that all you have to do is click on one of these boxes here, and you can either only include tagged events from this timeline, only include events between two particular years, and you can select those, or you can check the box Limit Events to the lifetime of the individual that you're coming up with the chronology for. Now one other thing that you might want to do when you're in Chronology Options is go to the Formatting tab right beside Include, and you can color code certain things. I always color code the individual, the spouse, the marriage, the children, and the timeline events in color. Now you can also find the chronology options in many of the other reports. It can be a selection in the family group records, but you do have to look for it. So when you open family group records and you're coming up with your title, you just click on Include Chronology Pages and select your chronology options. Now, when we take a look at Lawrence Murphy's chronology, you can see that it's changed. In the first instance, you'll notice that there are a number of items that are in a red font because that's the color I selected for chronology. So when you take a look at that, you have additional information that comes from those 5 timelines that we added. And the other item you'll notice is that I have not double bracketed anything, so all of the information that I put in about those facts or events is included at this point. At some other point I could double bracket it and take it out, but at this point, when I just want to learn more about it or put his life in context, I tend to leave all the information in. Perhaps if I ran this off for a family member, I'd use the double brackets, but right now I don't want to leave anything out. And this is another page which will show you, and I just wanted to give you an example that since I've added the population information, I now know the population of the state of Washington in 1900, and if I didn't have the census entered, I'd know I should be looking for it because Lawrence lived in the state of Washington in 1900. But I can take a look at the census and see how his family relates to that. Now, some final thoughts. Legacy is a robust program, and you can add and improve the timelines. I think you should focus on the areas and topics that are of interest to you and that you think would help add meat to the bones of your ancestors' stories. And finally, I'd encourage you to offer to share your timelines so we're not all reinventing the timelines wheel here. And perhaps we can suggest to Legacy that they have a special section at their website that we can all add our timelines to and share with each other. Now, I'm happy to answer any questions or to go into my Legacy program if you want to play around with the timelines feature. And I don't know if any of you were doing that while we were here in the Hangout. Otherwise, I thought we could go offline and open our meeting up to a general discussion. I'm wondering if you've attended any webinars that you might suggest others watch, if you're currently having any issues with Legacy, and maybe even if you have envy over the new Roots Magic update. As far as our December Legacy Virtual Users Group meeting, I thought we could take a well-earned break for the holidays and then come back raring to go in January. And when we get back together in January, I thought we could have a roundtable discussion of add-on programs that we use with Legacy. Kind of like what are the half-dozen programs or apps that you have at the top of your list for making Legacy work for you. And maybe if you got anything special from Santa to help you with your Legacy program or your genealogy. I'd like to thank Jenny Davis and Linda McCauley for being here at our Legacy Hangout. I know there were a few of you who had signed up and then didn't seem to see the invitation in the stream. We also had a little trouble recording it this time, and so I ran through the presentation that I gave live for this recording, and if you have any questions or if there's anything you'd like to go over about timelines or you have any suggestions, I would appreciate it if you would add these to our page on Google+, and we can discuss it in January. So thanks so much for watching this recording, and hope to see you again in January. Have a good holiday.